Good evening. I'm Selwyn Collins, your host of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. Thank you for joining us. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, a very special thank you. I am smiling because in my studio is one of my childhood friends. And I'm anticipating a very, very informative, very wonderful conversation. But as he put it, we're going to have a gap tonight. And I'm looking forward to it. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me take a moment to introduce you to CWS. At CWS, we have conversations with people about their journey. How are they using their gifts and talents to help others? How are they making a positive contribution to humanity? So I'm always looking for someone who is doing something extraordinarily well or doing extraordinary things. And it is my belief that each of us has a story. So I'm not prejudiced against people coming on the show and talking about themselves because at CWS, it's about creating a space where people can be their best selves. I believe that when we connect, when we share, it is when we are most expressing our humanity. I believe also that when we give beyond ourselves is one of the greatest gifts. When we do not know what to expect, when we have no expectation, we do not know the extent of our gifts. Imagine, I would tell all my guests this, imagine you talking about your journey, talking about your successes, but then you mention some of your challenges and how you might have overcome them. Now imagine a young boy or a young girl listening to you and recognizing a similar challenge or recognizing that they too can. And imagine that person one day becoming perhaps a geneticist or an oncologist or someone who stops a genocide, maybe a head of state. The beauty about humanity is not knowing what is going to happen, but giving anyway. And when I say this, I relate to many of the great leaders that went before us. People like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Mahatma Gandhi. People who made huge sacrifices without knowing that they will be around to see the effects of their sacrifice. We are fortunate, and I'm happy that I'm living in this era to have witnessed those like Nelson Mandela. So, with that said, I'm always encouraging people to do their best. You have an idea, commit to the idea, regardless of how challenging it is. Commit to it. Us sharing tonight in this medium, which is an amalgamation of technologies, is because someone's had an idea and they stuck with it. Now imagine Facebook, which most of us flock on. If Mark Zuckerberg had decided, you know what, this is too big for me, I'm not going to do it. Imagine that. Imagine if Steve Jobs had decided, iPad, what is that? Nobody's going to use something like that. Nobody's going to use an iPod for music. Nobody's going to use iTunes. Imagine that. Imagine the medicines that we use. The persons or people who discovered some of these vaccines. I decided, you know what, my friends are going to laugh at me if I tell them that this is possible. And I decided not to do it. So I'm saying to you tonight, when you have an idea, stick with it. Focus, commit. Some will laugh. The world doesn't benefit from the ordinary. The world benefits from the extraordinary. So be extraordinary, be remarkable. Do things that your friends or most people will not normally do. I'll take a break, and when I return, my friend, my brother, Graham Locke. We are back, and those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Selwyn Collins, your host of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. The gentleman next to me is my friend, Graham Locke. Graham, good evening, my brother.
Cello, nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I have to say that when I walked in here, there's more equipment here than at a Rolling Stones concert. I was quite impressed and somewhat overwhelmed. But
thank you. I want to start, Graham, with, well, proud parent of a child with autism, IT professional, certified in project management and supply chain, graduate of Boston University and CUNY. Okay, get that out of the way. Greg, you were born in Guyana and now live in the USA. How have these two countries shaped you?
Well, I was actually born in England. I
Oh,
grew up
sorry.
in Guyana.
Sorry.
And I've been living here since, December of 1982, which means that, well, I have triple nationality, but I'm always surprised, but I've lived in the United States longer than I've lived anywhere else because my heart and soul still says I'm Guyanese. If somebody asks me where I'm from, I sometimes have to stop and say, okay, are you asking me where I was born? Are you asking me where I live? Are you asking me where I grew up? Are you asking me where my parents are from? I'm not quite sure because I'm a bit of an amalgamation of several things. So, the difference between the United States and Guyana, for me, the United States for me has always been obviously a land of opportunity. It truly is a land of opportunity. I am, however, very proud and grateful of my Guyanese upbringing because there were never any boundaries set on what we are capable of achieving. There's, I grew up in a house, excuse me, I have 6 sisters. At one time I lived in a house with 6 sisters, my maternal grandmother, a cat, female cat, and it was just me and my dad. I mention all that to say that there were never any predefined gender roles in my house. Matter of fact, you may have been in my class when we did cookery and needlework and all that stuff at Bishop's. But on a larger scale, I think the biggest difference for me, where we grew up, we had African American teachers, well, I shouldn't say African American, Afro-Guyanese, sorry. Teachers, doctors, professionals, airline pilots, policemen, mayors, what have you. And the thing that I found when I moved to the States was that people sort of have their dreams or their aspirations sort of redefined by what they look like. There's a book that I don't remember the name of the author. I'm really terrible with names. It's called The Dream Dies Young, or The Dream Died Young, which was a study of grade school kids in Boston. Everybody, when you're in a kindergarten or first grade or whatever, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a doctor, I want to be a pilot, I want to be a this, I want to be a that. Over the course of the next few years, when you ask those same kids, what do you want to be? You've found that one group of kids has been either consciously or subconsciously steered towards, well, maybe you're going to be a good mechanic. The one ethnic group might be steered towards custodial functions, while the other group is steered towards being, professional doctors and lawyers and things like that. Even with things like football, which is one of my favorite sports, one of the things that they pointed out is that one of the reasons why you find so few outstanding African American linemen or offensive linemen is because they're not expected to be smart enough to play the position. So all of that to say that I am fortunate that I left Guyana when I did. I lived in Guyana for as long as I did, so that I never succumbed to feeling that I was only able to accomplish X because of what I look like.
Well, talking about that, can you give us a glimpse into the life of the 8-year-old Graham? What was he like at 14? I feel kind of awkward asking you the 14-year-old question,
right.
but hear me out.
Right.
I have to do my job. And who did he become at 24? Right? So the 8-year-old Graham, what he was like, who he was like at 14, or who he was at 14, who he became at 24, and who do you believe he's evolving into?
Well, let's see. The 8-year-old Graham was the chubby kid with the big afro. Actually, that afro saved my life. My cousin actually pulled me out of a lake by my afro when I was about 8.
Wow.
I had nightmares about drowning all for basically right up until college, but I digress. At 14, you and I were in high school together. At 14, I was as likely to be in a classroom as in detention. At 24, having completed my undergraduate studies at Boston University, I was a very I was quite driven actually to succeed in my chosen field, even to the extent that I sort of became a workaholic. I remember even being miserable on vacation. I remember there was one time I had a week off and I went to work on Wednesday. And my boss looked at me and I said, "Don't ask." Because basically I didn't have much going on outside of work, which looking back I realized that that's not a good thing. I think I covered up some other issues I was probably dealing with by making myself a workaholic and convincing myself that being a workaholic was a cool thing. So that takes me to 24. Not sure how much of that, a lot of that still kind of lingers. I do, from time to time, work has been my, I've used work to fill my voids. I've used work to distract myself from other pressing things that are going on in my life, where it's easier to sit in front of a computer or manage something that's extremely complex, because you get into the mindset of there only being 24 hours in a day, and if you work 22 of them and you crash for the remaining 2, well, it means you don't have any time left in the day to dwell on anything else. So yeah, I definitely recognize that I have used work as a void filler quite often.
I want to just bring your parents into it. What is your fondest memory of your parents, and how would you say they influenced you?
Hi mom, hi dad. My parents are as dissimilar as chalk and cheese, and this is their own expression. They may end up achieving, or my mom's philosophy is maximize what you can get. My dad's philosophy is minimize what you can lose. He is a much more of the conservative, and she's much more of the optimist and much more aggressive in just about everything. I think my dad is that way because and I know this for a fact, having conversations with him, that once he became a parent, he's extremely risk averse. He's an extremely responsible, loyal, dedicated parent. Both of them are, in their own way. I think in some ways I inherited the risk averse tendencies from my father. My mom kind of has this philosophy of almost like, hey, what's the worst that can happen? You pick yourself up and do it all over again. A couple of my sisters have more inherited her traits. So there is some balance. Sometimes there isn't balance, because sometimes you can look at them as being two sides of the same coin. Sometimes you have to look at them as two completely different coins. It just depends. But they've been married for 52 years now. Is it 52 or 51? I forget. I'm 50, so it's 52. My mom celebrates actually her 75th birthday in a couple of weeks.
Happy birthday, Mom.
Yeah, so she wasn't too happy when I mentioned that last time, but I figure I'm already in trouble. I'll say it again.
Trouble you like, Graham.
Well, you know me.
Trouble. Anyway, outside of them, Who would you say had the most influence on you as a young boy?
Um, Most of the people who had uh, positive, lifelong influences are people actually that you know. One of them, obviously, and she's always at the top of my list, is Miss Jarvis, our headmistress. My favorite teacher, Miss Doharis. Although when I think of Miss Doharis, I remember one of her, when I see her, the first words that come to my mind is, "Graham Locke, would you like me to wring your fat neck?" It's hard to imagine that would be one of my favorite teachers, but certainly she is. I learned a lot from both of them. Outside of the academic circle, my late uncle, Donald, Jono's dad, who, rock star.
Yep.
He has to be the most popular person that I've ever met. And a lot of it actually rubs off on Jono himself, because there have been times, in fact I was even having this conversation with him recently. We were on we'd gone fishing on a party boat out of City Island. And I think I went to get a couple of beers or something. And in the 5 minutes that it took me to get them and come back, Jono had about 5 or 6 people around him who he'd never met, didn't know, and they were all chatting like they'd known each other forever. And I remember that particular, being about 5 feet away and saying, "Oh my God, that's exactly like how Uncle Donald was." Because Uncle Donald could walk into a gay bar in Outer Mongolia, and within 5 minutes, whether he spoke the language or not, he'd be having a great time with everybody there. And you meet him once, and you have a friend for life. From him, he's kind of a counterfoil to my father, who's his brother. But from him, I think the epitome of openness and warmth and good times. So he was also a strong influence. I actually envied his ability to connect with people.
Wow. I don't know if this is an unfair question, Graham, but did you enjoy school as a child, a teenager, and what was your favorite subject?
I hated school. Like I said, I spent more time in detention than in the classroom. I was good at the sciences, and I was always good at math. Math came very, very easily to me. It was very, very logical. Music to this day, I mean, I'm sure I have the lowest recorded score in music in our high school. To this day, it's not necessarily a record I'm proud of. But I enjoyed anything with science, and especially with numbers, because I think it's just the way my mind is organized. I cannot remember things. For example, history never really made sense to me, although I understand the value of it. Because I couldn't remember that in 1721, this particular explorer from Italy discovered this thing in this part of the world. I honestly didn't care. But give me a math problem, give me a calculus problem that took 3 pages to solve, and I was in my element. I think I did either 2 or 3 math courses for O levels. I did pure and applied math, I did CXC math, and I did another one. So plus I did physics, and that also led into me studying electrical engineering. Again, it's just the way my mind is organized. Ask me a question about geography, history, music, I'm clueless.
You became a pilot, right? Or you learned to fly. And as a hobbyist, you fly model aircrafts.
Yeah.
What do you enjoy the most about your hobby?
Well, going back to flying, let's start with real airplanes and work my way down from there. Flying was also, or is also, a very good extension of of the way my mind works, and it's an extension of my personality. It's all very logical. It's all very sequential. It's all very analytical. I've always wanted to learn to fly. My good friend, going way back to the kindergarten, Jackie Chumley, I don't know if I should, but she was in our kindergarten. But another good friend of mine, Nigel Mann, who also became a pilot later on. From the time we were 4 or 5 years old, we were always building either paper planes or stick planes and things like that. And I always had an incredible passion to learn to fly. I had the opportunity after I finished college. I started taking flying lessons at an airport in New Jersey. Didn't tell anyone about it, didn't tell my parents. I told my parents actually a couple of months before I actually earned my license. Part of the reason was that I had encountered, I was almost in an accident, and I literally was upside down in an airplane with my instructor. We were doing this stall maneuvers, and I ended up in a spin where the airplane was inverted, and I'm looking at the horizon upside down and at an angle, and I literally thought I was going to die. And the thought, and I don't know if I can never remember whether it's time speeds up or slows down, but the very conscious thought that I had when that happened was, this is going to freak my parents out. They don't even know I'm flying. And again, this is upside down. And I remembered my instructor, Henry Duran, a Cuban immigrant. His nickname was Henry Hazard. Very calmly, quietly, as if he's, ordering breakfast, saying, yeah, okay, you got it. He didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything, kind of snapped me out of it, and I was fine after that. I told them about it because I didn't want them to, I knew I'd made up my mind by the time we landed that I was not going to quit. So I told them about it, just hoping that it wasn't necessary, but I didn't want them to learn that I was taking flying lessons as a result of being in a pile next to the Garden State Parkway. But like I said, it's an extension. It's very logical, very sequential. You do things according to a checklist. You follow procedures. You always know what you're supposed to do next, who you're supposed to talk to next, what your speeds are, what your settings are, what your procedures are, what your alternates are. So it was very much an extension of my somewhat overly logical personality. To the extent even that when I did my first solo flight, I was actually whistling when I took off, and I didn't realize it at the time. I was actually whistling. I was that relaxed and that comfortable. However, it's gotten prohibitively expensive. I'm still addicted to anything that flies. I mean, I travel a fair amount for work, and I still get to the airport early enough to take pictures of airplanes. I do plane spotting and that type of thing. I love everything about aviation.
So what do you enjoy most about it as a hobby?
As a hobby, there's always something else I can do with one of my models. So I flew model airplanes, radio control airplanes for, it's got to be 20 years.
Gosh.
And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I was introduced to radio controlled helicopters. The degree of difficulty is much, much more, and I was immediately hooked. The thing about flying, whether it's airplanes or helicopters, is I'm building what I fly. I'm tuning the engines. I'm doing all the settings. I'm doing all the balancing, the stuff. And what I would do is, even if the manual says, do it this way, and this way, in just about every model that I've ever built and flown, I've tried to inject some other way of doing it, my own personality. Now, if you're an observer, you will see an airplane flying and doing whatever. You couldn't distinguish that from any other one that's flying. But I know that I did something different and it flies perfect.
No, now that you said that, Graham, I want to get this off my chest, right? And I really I have to. When we were children in high school, and I believe that if you had mentioned that you were going to be a pilot,
You would have fallen off your chair laughing?
no, no, not me. No. I think we would have lost some teachers. I think they might have left Bishop's High School believing that this school
It's cursed.
is now a home to the insane.
Right.
Because Graham, I mean, this is a different. It's tough. I mean, this is fun for me to sit opposite you and have this conversation. But because we grew up together, Graham, you being a pilot, when I first learned that,
Right.
I almost called Floyd Fraser. I said, "Will you believe Graham flies?" But anyway, I am glad you're now flying model aircraft, Graham. But parenting a child with autism,
Yeah.
right?
Bob, you made that jump, but go on.
Yes, yes. Let's. I have a lot of questions for you,
Please do.
and you know, time. Sometimes the time seems long, but it creeps up on us,
I
right?
hear you.
They said the definition of autism is a neurological disorder that causes impairments in communication, ability to learn, and social relatedness. Autism usually strikes during the first 3 years of a child's life. Parents often tell of a normal, talkative child who suddenly seems to disappear before their eyes. The cause of autism is unknown. When I ask you this question, we take a quick break.
Sure.
When was your daughter diagnosed with autism, and what was the type?
She was diagnosed at about just a few months shy of her 4th birthday. Everything that you describe is 100% accurate. It's very cold and clinical. It's not your fault. It's not a criticism. I'm just saying that everything that you describe is from the point of view of a mental health or a disability, a professional. We started seeing signs that some things were wrong. However, some of those were actually obscured by the fact that she had, several health issues when she was born. So she had acid reflux and she was throwing up all the time. She also had chronic ear infections, which meant that she could not hear very well. She ended up having to have ear tubes for the first time in 18 months. We had assumed all along that her silence, although she was very talkative initially, that her silence was due to the fact that she simply couldn't hear herself. As a matter of fact, when we had scheduled her for surgery, the ear, nose, and throat surgeon had said, turn your backs, your ears. And then she kind of mumbled something into her own hands. So it was basically like, it was like if you've gone swimming and you're underwater and you're hearing sounds. We were horrified that her hearing was that bad. But we attributed her lack of speech to that. When she had the ear tubes put in, actually her speech output went up, but then it plateaued again. And this time there was no real explanation for it. There were other signs also that she may have been on the spectrum. Again, neither me nor her mom, we're divorced, I'll just throw it out there, it's just a fact, knew nothing about autism. I mean, who does, right? I mean, at that time, 10 years ago, I think it was 1 in 150 kids or 147 kids, something like that, were expected to be diagnosed at some point in their life with autism. In less than 10 years, that number has dropped to 1 in 100. So some of the signs that we noticed, in addition to the diminished speech output, was what I call like silo behavior, which is a deep but narrow interest in limited areas. She, for example, if you had a ceiling fan, whether it's in a house or a restaurant, she could stare at a ceiling fan, not a wall fan, not anything else is turning. She was fascinated by anything that was moving. There were other times where she was fascinated just by little things that kids her age should get over very quickly. She was also missing some of her developmental goals in terms of things like pointing or things of attracting attention. However, like I said, and I don't, looking back, maybe part of it was denial, but many of those issues were clouded or partially explained by other things that were going on. Like I said, the things with the hearing, the things with the acid reflux and other things like that. However, there was a point at which, around the time where we both kind of looked at one another and said, okay, something isn't right here. My sister, who studied psychology, actually called me up. She said that she'd been thinking about it for weeks, but didn't know how to broach the topic. And finally, she's actually my daughter's godmother, but actually just one day called and said, Graham, I think you need to have your daughter evaluated. And it was just coincidental because it was right around the time that we concluded that something wasn't right. That started a dizzying cycle of hopping from one professional to the next. Whether it was, we went to speech therapists, speech pathologists, audiologists, special needs teachers, ABA instructors, child psychologists, developmental psychologists, occupational therapists. It just went on and on and on. And while at her age, she was not officially diagnosed with autism, several of the signs were there. So,
I'm curious, how have you dealt? I wanted to ask you this question for some time now, but this is a good opportunity to do this. How have you dealt? How did you deal with the initial realization that your daughter, your only child, was diagnosed with autism?
It hit me like a ton of bricks, but for the longest time I acted as though it did not hit me like a ton of bricks. Because, fast forwarding a few years, and I'll now kind of go back to that time period, I came to realize that part of the adjustment process from going from assuming that everything's okay, with your child when she's born. She's got 10 fingers, 10 toes, beautiful eyes, to the realization within 3 years that your child has autism. There was actually, I realized, an extended period of, I have to call it mourning. I think there's the 5 stages of grief. There's the denial, there's the anger, there's the bargaining, there's all this type of stuff. I can't remember the other 2. Acceptance comes last. I forget the 4th one. I don't think I realized at the time, but I really was grief-stricken for quite a long time.
When your sister called you
Yeah.
It was Faith, you said?
No, it was her name was Adiola.
Adiola, and Adiola called you. Now looking back, you think it was easier that it came from your sister than a stranger?
Yes, because again, she didn't come straight out and say that she had autism. It's not, it's not her place to make that kind of call.
Right.
All she knew was that from working with kids, also having worked with special needs kids, and also with, I think the politically correct term is typically developing kids.
Mm-hmm.
She knew that there were some things that our daughter was not doing that she should have been doing. There's always a, there's a bell curve, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
There is a bell curve. And, most people are going to hit that bell curve at the top, and then there's going to be a few stragglers. But there were some areas in which she was clearly, several degrees away from, or several orders of I can't remember the exact mathematical expression, but she was definitely outside the curve, and dangerously so. So we had sort of come to the conclusion that there was something going on. Mm-hmm. I don't know that autism had actually entered our terminology at that time. I think before the age of 3, they call it PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, mm-hmm. which may or may not lead to an eventual diagnosis of autism.
That was the first diagnosis,
yes.
PDD. When you heard that, did you have thoughts of autism, the possibility of it, or you were just focusing on PDD? And the reason why I'm asking you this, right, is to get at this. Was there hope?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. The analogy that I have used actually on a couple of occasions. When I left college, I couldn't find a real job for almost 2 years. Actually, that's the main reason I ended up in graduate school, was to keep the student loan people off my back. But when I was doing that interviewing process, I didn't want to go back to school. When I was doing the interviewing process, you always have to have hope. You have to have a positive attitude. Mm-hmm. So with every person, every job I applied to, every interview I went to, you have to lift yourself up. You have to keep your chin up. You've got to be smiling. You've got to be strong. And then if it doesn't work out, you're crushed. Mm. But you somehow have to do it all over again the next time your phone rings. And you do it over again and over again and over again. The reason I bring that up is autism isn't it's not an off and on definition. It's not, you either have diabetes or you don't. You either have cancer or you don't. You either have a broken leg or you don't. With autism, the eventual diagnosis, unless somebody is profoundly autistic, the eventual diagnosis is sort of a drip, 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 where, for example, my daughter had to have a CAT scan because they wanted to make sure she didn't have a lesion of some kind on her brain. She was examined by a speech pathologist to make sure she didn't have apraxia. She was examined by she had to have a sleep study done to make sure she didn't have, she wasn't having a petit mal seizure. She was not epileptic. So there was one night that we were in Mount Sinai Hospital with the electrodes all over the head, and me looking at her and trying to figure out, how do they expect a kid to sleep with that stuff all over them? But she managed. So it's the process of elimination. So you start off thinking, okay, maybe there is something systemic here. And after we do this particular physical, neurological, whatever examination, that might tell us, oh, okay, she's got this disorder. She's got something in her brain. She's got a fracture. She's got, she's deaf. She's this. She's that. She's got some kind of a neurological disorder, but not an autism neurological disorder. But okay, that's eliminated. No, neurologically, systemically, she's fine. Okay, well, maybe it's her hearing. Maybe the reason she doesn't talk is because she is completely deaf. So they do the whole thing where they stick the probes in your ear and they measure the nervous response and blah, blah, blah. No, her hearing is somewhat compromised because of all the ear infections she's had, but she's certainly in the high 80s in terms of her percentile. Then they do the next thing to make sure that she's not suffering from seizures. Nope, she does not. And with every one of those crossed off, there's like this inexorable march towards that final conclusion that it's almost like they say, well, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. I guess she has autism, sorry.
Let's take a break.
Sure.
But when we get back, I want you to answer Esther's question, but let me read a few things from the chat room. For Sharon said, keep it rolling. ACCCB said, GBL, this will be good. Sharon said, happy birthday, moms, LOL. And this is the question from Esther. Good evening, gentlemen. Mr. Locke, could you tell us how having a child with autism has... We are back with Graham Locke. Graham, the question before the break is, how has your child, or parenting a child with autism, changed you as a person?
It's a complicated answer, and I know I'll try to at least just hit the high points. Mm-hmm. It's made me a lot more. It's made me a very, very patient person. I think it's also made me a lot more empathetic towards both parents as well as children who have special needs of any kind. It took me a long time to actually be grateful. It took me a long time to actually be grateful for what I have. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Actually, in the quote on when you were promoting this particular conversation, mm-hmm. There's a reason why I try to stress the term a child with autism versus an autistic child. Mm-hmm. You and I are at that age. We have classmates, for example, who have had cancer and who've had this and who've had that. We don't refer to them as, cancerous Mary, mm-hmm. or, diabetic Bob.
Come closer to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Diabetic Bob. So one thing I had noticed, especially in the earlier stages of this very difficult journey, is that I was focusing much more on the autism than on the child with the autism. I did not enjoy, for me, parenting. I love my child dearly. Mm-hmm. I hated being a parent, mm-hmm. because I felt impotent. I couldn't, I couldn't do anything about her condition. And it took a long time for me to kind of stop seeing her as let me put it this way. Early on, her entire life, and therefore our entire life, revolved around the next appointment. Okay, she goes to school from this time to this time. Then she has speech therapy from this time to that time. Then she has occupation therapy from that time to that time. Then she's got play therapy from this. It was always about getting a head start on the areas that autism takes a toll on children with. So I also had to confront that even though I always did my best as her parent, I was not always at my best. You mentioned hope a few minutes ago. There was a point where I realized that I didn't have, I felt like I'd lost a lot of hope and everything for me was bleak, and for everything for her was bleak. But I realized that I had been carrying around so much, literally, grief that I wasn't addressing, that I wasn't treating. And those people that know me know that I really was in a dark, bleak place for quite a long time. I'm grateful that I had a couple of moments of clarity, and I finally decided that, and actually our friend Sharon, our mutual friend, was one person who's always said to me that you should do like they tell you when you're in the airplane. When the oxygen masks come down, put it over your own face first, take care of yourself so you can take care of the child next to you. And I had focused on everything and everyone else but myself, and I really was a mess. I had a severe untreated depression. It's just a fact. A couple of years ago, I actually, in one of those moments of clarity, I knew that even though I was doing my best, I wasn't at my best, and I knew I needed help. I knew I needed to find a way to be a better parent. And I actually met a psychiatrist, an older Jewish gentleman. And I realized that I had about 6+ years of absolute bottled up emotion. Fear, sadness, grief, disappointment, not disappointment in her, but disappointment for her. Almost, denial, guilt was a huge part of it, because when you're in that deep, dark place, you can actually manage to convince yourself that somehow it's your fault. What did I do wrong? Even though neither of us did anything wrong. And I finally, I finally was able to talk to someone. And, the first time I met this guy, I'll never forget, they do the usual thing where they take, your name and address and your insurance information, and they ask you if you're suicidal, if you're a danger to yourself or to somebody else, blah, blah, blah. So he put down his writing pad after he took all this information. He crossed his legs and he kind of put his hands over his chest like this and said, "Okay, so, Mr. Locke, why are we here?" And I sat there and I cried uncontrollably for like 10 minutes. I just sat there and I cried. I had so much stuff that was built up that I never allowed myself to feel anything, because I guess deep down I always felt that if I ever allowed any of those feelings to take over, that it would weaken me. Because being a parent of a child with autism is a constant battle. You're always fighting. You're fighting your school district for extra services. You're fighting your insurance company to pay for speech therapy. You're fighting you're fighting to have your child placed in this classroom as opposed to that classroom. You're battling with the school district over her individualized educational plan. So I always felt that I had to be on, I had to be hard, I had to be aggressive, I had to be tough. While on the inside, I was just an absolute mess. Coming back to the original question, how it has changed me, it has definitely made me a lot more patient, because you cannot adequately parent without a tremendous amount of patience. Because whereas it might take a typically developing kid 3 or 4 times to learn something, it might take you 400 or 4,000. And it may seem as though, this is a waste of my time, or maybe she's never going to get it. But the minute you do that, then you start saying, then you're basically seeing her not as the child, but as the disability. So it's always, you have to almost like consciously push back. No. Whatever else she is, she's a child first and foremost. And with other children on the spectrum that I've encountered, I think I talked about this recently. I've had experiences where I've been, hit by a child who was having a meltdown. And I remember this father apologizing profusely and being humiliated and upset and everything else. It's okay. It's okay. Because the child isn't a bad child. The child is in a situation that he or she can't control. I've had a kid, destroy a pair of expensive sunglasses. Again, the parent was upset to the point where he was trying to put money into my hands to repair it. I said, no, I don't want it. Because, I want people to be nice to my child. I think it's the fear of any parent who has a child with special needs, that people will not be nice to them. That people will see them for their needs instead of their childhood.
What do you think is the greatest misconception people have about autism?
Wow.
Or one of them?
Well, there's several. I think the one thing, a lot of people see autism in either one of 2 ways. I never actually saw the movie, but Rain Man. People think of autism as, you've got somebody who's kind of quirky, but they're brilliant. They can recite this and they can do that, and so it's not that big a deal. Okay, they're kind of quirky and they have photographic memories and maybe they dress weird. That's one extreme. There's the other extreme of the more challenged. Again, autism is a spectrum disorder.
Right.
You've got people who have autism who have PhDs. On the other end, you've got people who have autism who are teens that are not toilet trained, or cannot be toilet trained. So either you can be optimistic and see the quirky guy, the quirky Rain Man guy on one end of the spectrum, or you can see the kid acting out and screaming and throwing tantrums and this type of stuff. There is a lot more to autism than that. And again, there is a lot more to the children that have autism than that. There are one of the common traits, and I think you described this at the beginning, is children with autism struggle with language. Not necessarily with speech, but with language. And language is one of the most organic things that we pick up. Very few people actually have to teach their kids to talk. Most kids by 3 not only have a vocabulary of hundreds or maybe even a couple of thousand words, but they are almost like 100% grammatically correct. It is a complete mystery for kids who have autism. Children learn language and then they use language to learn. and I need to repeat that. Children learn language organically, with no help, just from listening to people around them. They learn language, and then they use language to learn. So if you have a kid who is on the spectrum, whose language centers don't work properly, it obviously it inhibits their ability to learn. It doesn't make them incapable of learning. It just means that one has to find other pathways to learn, or other pathways to improve language. The other thing about autism, and when I mentioned the professor on one end of the spectrum, there's this Indian guy, PhD in math, as I said. When he got to the point where he was actually speaking by the time he was a teen, and he described his personal experience with autism. It doesn't mean he's cured. It just meant it's manageable. That imagine you are on a 10-lane highway. You're driving the wrong way. And every car that's coming towards you has flashing lights and sirens and horns, and they're all zigzagging all over the place. What happens is a lot of kids on the spectrum get neurologically overwhelmed very, very quickly. You and I are talking. If we were to hear an ambulance go by, maybe hear somebody running in the corridor, a phone ringing, a baby crying, whatever, we can immediately pick it up and dismiss it. A lot of kids on the spectrum don't have that filter. And, speaking in computer terms, every input, every interrupt is treated with exactly the same level of priority. So as I'm talking to you, if you were to imagine that you're listening intently to me, if a fire engine goes by or an ambulance goes by, just imagine that all of a sudden you're compelled to pay as much attention to that noise and those lights as with me. And if your microwave goes off, beep 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 beep, or a cell phone or whatever, so imagine how bombarded you feel very, very quickly by that overloaded information. I saw this with my own eyes. Actually, my nephew's birthday party a couple of years ago was at a bowling alley, and I took my daughter there. There were two separate parties. There were kids bowling in two separate lanes. There were video games. There was a DJ. And all of these things were all taking place. And so we went in, we're there for a few minutes. And I glanced over my shoulder, and my daughter was literally in the fetal position on the floor with her hands over her ears. It wasn't necessarily that any of the noises were so loud that it was painful, but she was being bombarded and unable to filter out what was not important. There's another Japanese kid who said that his experience is like being locked in a room with 10 different radios and 10 different TVs, and he has no control over the dial. So you're literally overwhelmed by the information that you can't filter it out. So quite often, a kid having a meltdown, a kid having a bad day, may just be in in sensory overload. As a matter of fact, we went to see Spider-Man a few weeks ago, me, my youngest sister, and my daughter. She had a great time. She was bouncing up and down in her seat. Everything was great. Spider-Man actually, he swung up to our aisle, gave her a high five, did the whole thing. She was having a great time. And about 10 minutes before the end, she went from having a ball to crying uncontrollably. She had just hit her saturation level. And I took her out in the environment, and this was one of these theaters that has autism-friendly performances. I took her to a quiet room, and she was fine shortly after that. other kids, even though this performance was autism friendly, it was just too much stimulation. So in terms of things to understand about kids who are on the spectrum, many of them are of average or perhaps even above average intelligence. Unfortunately, if you can't express it, no one knows it. You start to see, you might get little clues. For example, one of my daughter's little idiosyncrasies is she has an absolutely photographic memory. If she's been somewhere once, no matter how many years ago, and there was something of any interest, it could be something she had to eat there, or maybe there was a bookstore nearby, or one of her relatives lived there. She can identify it immediately. She also does weird things, and I think I'd said this before, like putting together jigsaw puzzles without ever seeing the picture. Because she has with her other deficiencies, her visual memory is her strongest attribute. And the pathway to her learning is using her strengths as opposed to her weakness or her deficiencies. That's a huge challenge in special education because no two kids are exactly alike, and therefore no two kids are going to react the same way to the same teaching methods.
What would you say to parents who have just received a diagnosis such as this, that their child has autism?
There's a cute phrase that I remember hearing someone use, saying that the expression "your child has autism" doesn't necessarily have to have a period at the end. There should be a but, or there should be an and, and there should be a however. The thing about it is, though, I'm speaking again from personal experience, with just about every other ailment, affliction, disability, whatever, there is a beginning and a middle and an end. If somebody has diabetes, somebody has cancer, okay, this is what you have, this is the path of treatment, this is the anticipated, expected, hoped for result. With autism, since no two kids are exactly the same, and there is almost no predictability about what works and what doesn't work, it is overwhelming, because if for your entire life you're accustomed that somebody has either a physical or a mental ailment, it can be looked at under a microscope, you can do a blood test, you can do this, you can do that, and once you've identified it, you can do something about it. This is one of those exceptions. It's identified almost by the process of of elimination, unless somebody is, severely autistic, which means that you can pick up on it very quickly. But the flip side of that is it's very, very difficult to chart a course as to what's going to happen next. If somebody is receiving chemo or radiation therapy, somebody has a broken bone, for example. I'll stay off of cancer because it's a lot more serious than. Somebody has a broken bone. You know that if you put a cast on, then in 6 to 8 weeks you can take the cast off. There's going to be a lump where the bones would knit, and 4 or 5 weeks after that, that's going to dissolve. You twist your ankle, you have a tooth knocked out, you have this, you have that. You've lost your hearing, you need a hearing aid. But with autism, it's so difficult to predict what works, what doesn't work. There are high rates of regression with some kids. which is why actually a lot of kids who are on the spectrum attend summer school, because you take a kid out of the environment, of a classroom environment for 10 to 12 weeks, and it's almost like the previous semester never took place. What would I say to a parent from the lessons that I myself learned is allow the emotional process to run its course, or accept the fact that there is something that's akin to grieving, because it really is that. There is it is devastating to hear. I mean, once you've done that, once you've navigated that course, you are now ready to do the battles that you will need to do.
What do you do for fun with your daughter?
Just about anything. There was like, I think after I got help from my own depression, and which I think was blocking me from the happy part of being a parent, where I was seeing her as an autistic child, and I was dealing with autism versus dealing with a child with autism, as in my daughter. I mean, she is absolutely fun to be around. She goes with the flow. She is, in some ways, she scares the crap out of me because she's completely fearless. She taught herself to swim, for example. You know, we were in the pool. One of her numerous therapies had to deal with strengthening her upper body, because a lot of kids also who have autism are awkward. Why are they awkward? Because one of the many weird things about autism is hypersensitivity to sound, hypersensitivity to touch, sometimes a loss of not knowing where their body is in space. Some kids always feel the need that they have to touch a wall, they have to touch a person. It's not that they're doing it because they want to touch you or they want to touch the wall. They absolutely don't know where their bodies start and end. There's I think the term is called sensory disconnectedness, or some big word like that, where they don't know where their body starts and ends, things that you and I take for granted. So one of the therapies that she was doing was in a pool, and we started noticing, you know, it was in a 2-foot section with the therapist, and she would be, you know, every opportunity she got, she'd pull away and try to go into the deeper water. So one day the therapist said, okay, we'll let her. And she doggy paddled her way to the 2-foot section, to the 4-foot section. Now she's over her head. I'm looking at her, She doggy paddled her way right over to the 11-foot section and giggling nonstop, and then turned around and doggy paddled her way right back to the other end of the pool. Now, unfortunately, because she was giggling nonstop, she was also drinking a lot of pool water, which means that on the way home, she kind of projectile vomited directly past my right ear from the car seat in the back. I saw this thing go by, and at first I thought I thought I left my sunroof open, but she basically emptied the pool right into my dashboard. All the things, I mean, she loves books. Again, because of her particular ailment, she has a deep and narrow interest in what she likes to read and what pictures she likes to see and things like that. But generally speaking, and when I talked a while ago about being happy for what I have, she does not exhibit many of the very negative behaviors that are typical in some kids with autism. So she's sort of in the middle of the spectrum. For fun, I mean, we've gone, you know, me, her, and my youngest sister, we go to puppet shows in Brooklyn. We've gone, as a matter of fact, I told you we saw Spider-Man. We're going to see another play soon. You know, she goes to the beach. She had a great time in summer camp and all this type of stuff. So, yeah, she's...
I have some questions in the chat room that are coming up, which I want to ask you, and I have several here. So let's do some rapid fire.
In other words,
session.
you're talking too much.
No, I'm not telling you talking too much. I will never tell you that. This is very interesting. Karen G in the chat room said there are lots of different discussions about autism and its causes, from vaccines, etc. What do you think about this, and do you have your only thoughts? And do you have your only thoughts about this? And do you care to share?
I can't remember the name of the guy who was the first person who put forward this theory that it's the vaccinations that cause autism. That was disproved or discarded years and years ago, but there are still people who hang on to that. There are people who hang on to childhood illnesses. For example, I mentioned that my child had, chronic ear infections and she was taking antibiotics and stuff like that. I'm a scientist, and I need things that are much more cause and effect proof. So I don't really have much of a. It's almost like mentally where I am right now. It's how the cookie crumbled. Mm-hmm. I do believe that there's an environmental component to it, especially since more and more people are getting it. But I do not believe in a vaccine theory.
Tracy D said, enlightening Graham. Thank you for opening up about your experience as a parent of a special needs child. Esther said, I echo that, Tracy D. This is quite a learning experience, and might I add, a positive one. Thank you, Mr. Locke. Jonathan, is it better to be public about this process? Tracy D, yes. Graham, describe a typical experience with scolding your daughter.
I rarely scold her. Mm-hmm. And I'll explain why. And a few minutes ago I talked about the fact that children with autism are children first and foremost. And with quite often kids with autism live in the moment. It's the best analogy that I've heard is you can't scold your puppy, for peeing on the floor 3 hours after he peed on the floor. Mm. It has to be in that moment. So on those occasions that my daughter does something that she's not supposed to, I have to do it there and then, but not necessarily as scolding, but almost as redirecting or relearning. Like, this is not okay. It might take 100 times, but she also knows what she can get away with. She's very manipulative. She knows what she can get away with me versus what she can get away with her mother. So there are several times that I've caught her doing something and she actually has the grace to blush when she's busted. So there's a lot going on there that she may just be incapable of expressing. But she knows that.
Oh, I wish a certain classmate of mine was light in complexion so we could have seen that blush. Well, what are some things in parenting a child with autism that might surprise the average person who's never had the experience?
The cost.
Cost.
It is, I think most studies show that roughly between 45 and 55% of marriages end in divorce in this country. That number is in the 80s for parents of children with autism.
Is that so?
In excess of 80%. Why? Because there are severe financial pressures. Very little is covered by insurance. Here's why. If I suffered from clinical depression, sure, my treatment with a psychiatrist, my medication, whatever would be covered. If I had some kind of a physical disease or ailment of some kind, the thing about autism is that someone with autism is not necessarily mentally ill. Someone with autism is not classified as being mentally ill. Mm-hmm. So for quite a long time, a medical doctor would say, well, it's not my problem. Let's go to the mental health person. The mental health person saying, this person is only autistic. They are not mentally ill. The insurance companies are caught in the middle, so they don't want to pay for anything. One conversation I had actually with someone in an insurance company when I was trying to get them to pay for speech therapy is if your daughter was in a severe car accident and she had a brain injury and she needed to relearn how to speak, even if it cost this insurance company $1 million over the next 3 years, we'd pay it. If you're telling us that your daughter was diagnosed with autism and you want her to have speech therapy, we're not paying for it because she's not an injury or a disease. B, we have no idea how she will respond. So we don't want to be paying, a speech pathologist or a speech therapist open-ended for something that, you can have 10 different people and have 10 different results. So it's extremely expensive. People with children on the spectrum rarely take vacation. I have not had a vacation since 2002 when my ex was pregnant. It is scary because every now and then the thought comes into your head of what happens to her if something happens to me. It can be frustrating, but I think, and for me, as long as I see her as my child first and foremost, and autism as being just one of the details about who she is, it's easier to manage. I think if you just look at autism itself, over the course of time, it becomes seemingly hopeless.
What have you learned about yourself as a parent of a child with autism, apart from patience? Because you mentioned that. What else have you learned about yourself?
In some ways, I've gotten, like I said, in some ways it's made me stronger. It forced me to deal with things that I probably otherwise would not have dealt with, because whatever struggles I had with depression may have predated her. I may have had it all my life, but it was just never at the level that it was. I could have lived my entire life and settled for the limits of joy, for example. Let me put it this way. For a long time, I never allowed myself to get too up on anything or too low on anything. But there's no way to love a child or love anyone and set, those careful boundaries. So I have to say that within, my daughter's going to be 11 in about 4 weeks. I have shed more tears in the last 10 and a half years, but probably also laughed more in the last 10 and a half years than I have in the previous 40. That's the absolute honest truth.
About those two contrasts, or that contrast rather, you spoke about a shift when at one time you were overwhelmed with this knowledge that here is your daughter with autism, but you were looking at it as an autistic child and it was overpowering, overbearing. And then there was a shift when you saw your child as your daughter with autism. What was that moment like for you?
It's more of a transition than a moment, and there were several things that I think helped. My youngest sister lives in Brooklyn. As a matter of fact, I think she's in the Dominican Republic this week. Lucky her. Over the last couple of years, she has really bent over backwards to connect with my daughter. I think a lot of people, and this is not poorly intentioned, don't quite know what to say or what to do with someone who doesn't seem to understand you, relate to you, might have weird behaviors or weird habits or whatever. I had no idea until she and I had a long conversation, maybe the beginning of last year, how deeply that she was also affected by it. This is her only niece. She was devastated by it, but like me, never acknowledged it. the thing that I also find is that every day my daughter wakes up with a broad grin on her face. Like, look out world, I'm going to get into some mischief. And she doesn't know she has autism. This is her life. This is her reality. She's looking outwards at us versus looking inward at her. And if she is going to be happy and fun and playful and everything else, then what right do I have to be anything but? I do regret the time that I was not at my best. But I'm grateful that I was treated. I finally started talking about it. Look, the fact that I can sit here and tell you and tell the hundreds or thousands or how many people are listening to this. My daughter has autism. For the first 7 years of her life, first 6+ years of her life, I couldn't get that sentence out without coming apart. That's how hard it was.
Graham, early on you spoke about that rhythm when you were 2 years looking for a job, where you had to pick yourself up and then dealt with the disappointment and then pick yourself up again. How do you find composure when it becomes too much?
Like I said, I have shed more tears and laughed more. I think I am, even though I'm not given to very public displays of emotion, I know that whether it's tears or it's laughter, it's a safety vault. It's a safety vault. It's like the top of a pressure cooker.
Gotcha.
And in those moments where, whether it's frustration, despair, disappointment, this, that, the other, that I need to, if I feel it coming on, I don't stop it.
Eileen in the chat room, Eileen A said, just wondering if Graham cares to share his initial reaction when he first heard the public story of the little boy who ran away from his school just before the end of the year last year.
Yes, it is the paralyzing fear of just about every parent of a child with autism. For several reasons. I mentioned this Japanese kid who talked about, his life feeling like he's in a room with a bunch of TVs and radios on. Why do kids with autism have a tendency to, there are two tendencies, not all kids, but some of them, many of them, to wander, to walk away, and to migrate towards water. Water is very soothing. If you're being bombarded physiologically, water, you can take a kid who's having a meltdown, put him in a pool, put him in a tub, whatever. 7 times out of 10, a lot of the symptoms will go away. The other thing that he talked about is that roads or pathways or things like that are inviting because you feel like you're a part of it. And the reason, and kids just tend to, kids on the spectrum have a tendency to want to be a part of something that they can control. So some kids bolt, which means they all of a sudden just run away. Other kids just kind of wander away. I get the feeling that this poor child, and I pray that it wasn't foul play. I kind of had a feeling within the first maybe month after he had disappeared that he was not going to be found alive. Is it terrifying? Absolutely. It is absolutely terrifying. It's very sobering, but at the same time you have to kind of keep things in perspective in that you can protect your child by building a wall or a fence to prevent him or her from doing things that other kids realize are dangerous. But the flip side of that is a fence also keeps you in. it limits your own possibilities, it limits your own horizons, it limits your own opportunities to learn. So there has to be some sort of balance. So it took a long time for me to feel comfortable not holding my daughter's hand when we were walking on the street. But I'm always extremely vigilant about where she is and what she's doing.
Abby said, "Thank you for sharing." Jonathan, "I have watched you in action and I'm amazed how patient you are with her and dedicated you are and how dedicated you are to raising your child. You should run a support group for fathers in the same situation." Karen G said, "You have come a long way emotionally. Kudos to you." Graham, if you care to share with us one important lesson your daughter has taught you about yourself as a father and as a man.
I've always been put it this way. Even before we had the ultrasound and we knew she was a girl, I knew she was a girl. I just knew. I told the technician, she needs to see it, but I don't. I know it's a girl. I had a connection to her from even before she was all the way out. It's amazing. Her eyes were open and she was looking directly at me. And my mom was there in the room with us and she saw it. It is, as I said, I don't think this is just unique to me. I don't think it's possible to be a parent and put limits or boundaries on your emotions. I think if you do that, then you'll have a child who doesn't explore the range of their own emotions. As a man, I think I've been pretty much the same. I've learned. I'm very similar to my dad. He has been an absolutely dedicated parent. As I said, he and my mom are two sides of the same coin, where every decision that he has made from the minute his first child was born has been, I want to make sure that what I do does not negatively affect her. I want to do, does not negatively affect my family. It has made me very, I suppose, risk averse. Like I said, I'm super protective. There are some adjustments that I know I need to make because I also need to allow my child to fall on her face from time to time. I'm doing a much better job of that.
What still surprises you about yourself as a parent?
Just that and again, I don't think it's unique to me. It never gets old. There's always something. And I know we're running short, but the thing that for me is, as I kind of came full circle with my own experience as a parent, I realized that regardless of what type of child you had, parenting is largely the same. We all celebrate the victories. So whereas my daughter's victories, maybe she was 7 when she finally figured out, because one of the things about kids with autism is fine motor skills, is figuring out how to zip up her winter jacket or buttons and shoelaces and things like that. So whereas a parent might be celebrating the fact that his son hit a home run or his daughter is in the dance team at school, the day my daughter finally figured out how to do her zipper, or the day she figured out, this summer, for example, I'm working with her riding a bicycle. The day she figured out how to swim and some of the other skills that maybe a lot of other kids accomplished earlier. Those are still things to celebrate, and that's not unique to me. I think that it's like it's like the difference between a jumbo jet and the very first airplane that the Wright brothers built. At their core, they are identical. It's the parenting is much more similar than it is different.
You said you've cried a lot and you've laughed a lot. When you think of the word happiness, what comes to mind?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm not sure what's the difference between being happy and being content. I think I have been a lot more content than I have been happy. Hopefully, I can be more happy than just content. But for me, it's been a spectrum because it hasn't been an easy journey. And to be quite honest, a few years ago, for me to sit here and say I'm content, I would never have imagined even saying, that would have been something I never pictured myself saying.
What is one thing about you, Graham, that most people do not know and you believe will surprise them?
Well, let's see. I think my mom is watching, so I can't talk about that.
And Miss Jarvis, maybe.
Oh, yeah. The one thing about me that surprises most people...
That will surprise them if they find it.
I think, well, look, it's unfortunate and a negative thing. I can be really mean at times. I think a lot of people think...
Give us a positive one, Graham.
Well, I can't think of a positive one.
Everybody knows everything about you, Graham?
Most people, my life...
Do they know that you were a heckler in school? That you like to heckle?
Well, they know now.
Okay.
If you won't stop talking on my ducky story.
All right. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Graham.
No, go on.
No, it's fine. This is your show, buddy.
No, I can't think of anything. I mean,
okay.
My life has largely been an open book. I have tried not to keep too many secrets.
Okay. What kind of music calms you down?
Latin ballads. I can listen to that stuff all day long. I can listen to Luis Miguel and I can listen to
Chick Corea.
Chick Corea is more like Latin jazz.
That's jazz, that's true.
But I listen to some of the most heartbreaking love songs in Spanish all day long. It is the most relaxing thing for me.
When are you most happy?
When am I most happy? Usually after I'm finding happiness in a lot of things. I'm finding happiness in spending more time with people. Finding happiness in accomplishing, some of my professional goals. The last couple of times, for example, that I've been to Guyana and just been able to spend like days at a time with my father have been amazing. We have sat down at that hotel, drank gallons of coffee, and just talked for hours and hours and hours.
But I can understand why your father is a great conversationist. I enjoy chatting with him. I didn't realize you had 6 sisters as well, Graham. Yep. That is one thing we have in common. You spoke about your 2 parents as being sometimes 2 opposites of the same coin or 2 different coins.
Different coins, right?
How to frame this? What have you learned from them that still resonates with you to this day?
They're both very, very strong personalities. My dad is a strong silent personality. My mom is a strong vocal personality. The thing that I think the thing that and I told this to my dad, I think was on his 80th birthday a couple of years ago. I told him that I hope someday to be half the parent he is. I hope someday to be just half of the parent he is. For the level for what he has sacrificed and given up, he's always put everyone else ahead of himself. So those are the things that I think that's probably the biggest thing that I learned from him. And for a long time growing up, I actually used to feel guilty about the fact that, when times were hard, because we went through some really rough periods in Guyana, when times were hard, they always bent over backwards, both of them always bent over backwards to make sure that we had normal or pseudo-normal or as close to normal Christmases and birthdays and whatever. And I don't think that they realized how much I knew about what was really going on and how much they were struggling. The minute I became a parent, it made perfect sense. It made absolute perfect sense. There was, speaking about my dad, for example, there were 2 occasions that I saw him kind of do this kind of a smirk thing, and he had 2 thumbs up. The first time was when I graduated from college. Actually, my elder sister Faith and I graduated at the same time. And when I saw him afterwards, I'm holding my, my tube, and and I thought he was just kind of, making a funny face or whatever. But on the night that my daughter was born, he was at the hospital. Of course, he's from the old school. He's not going to be in the room. He's outside, So when it was all over and he stuck his head in the room and I was holding my daughter, and he kind of did, and that's the first time it struck me like, oh my God, he just hit his emotional limit. That he was actually incapable of speaking. And at that time, years prior, this is going back to 1987, where I first saw that expression, where the first two of his kids graduated from college. That for him was like an endorsement or a justification for him for all the sacrifices that he made, for all the trips he made to all of our various schools, for the student loans that he took out, for all this type of stuff. He wanted nothing other than to see us walk across that stage wearing those square hats and carrying those tubes. And he had the same level of emotion seeing that as seeing his first grandchild.
I have a question to ask you about, I would consider an emotional moment for your mom at your birthday, but I'll ask you that just now.
Good.
I just want to go to the chat room quickly. Abby said, content is long-lasting regardless of situation or circumstance. Happiness can be fleeting. Praise God for you reaching contentment. Abby said, again, he loves to fly model planes and he has an incredible sense of humor. Don't I know that? Eileen A said, great show. Thanks for sharing. I now know a lot more about you, and have a better understanding of the world in which children with autism live. By the way, you look a lot like your father. ACCCB said he was heckling since STG, since Gabriel.
What's ACCCB?
I'm not at liberty to say, Graham. And like Abby says, he has an incredible sense of humor. He's still earning many dollars on Facebook. Abby said that does that smirk thing very often. He. Graham, quickly.
Yes.
Mom, at your party, she took out this.
Yes, the sweater.
The sweater that she knitted when you were 1, right?
That was as close. I think I was 6 months old.
6 months. What was that like for you, Graham?
Having a great time, and I came very close to losing it. I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I'd never seen it. I didn't even know she had it. And for her to be carrying it around for the better part of 50 years in 3 countries. We're, as I said, born in England, grew up in Guyana. We have lived in 2 addresses in Guyana, 1, 2, 3 addresses in this, a couple addresses in England, 2 in Guyana, and 3 or 4 in the States. And she's carried that thing around for the better part of 50 years. It was overwhelming. I think I was able to cover it up by putting it on my head.
Yeah, I know.
It kind of gave me a moment to kind of recover. But I was absolutely floored by that. Absolutely floored.
Thanks for sharing that. What stories, right, or story, and as quickly as possible, your parents always tell about you? Let's start with your mother, and then go to your father.
There was an incident, which I continue to deny, where apparently a one of those kitchen dustbins, as we call them in Guyana, somebody, allegedly me, climbed up on top of it in order to get on top of a cabinet. And allegedly I broke the thing, and I denied it. And you know I don't lie. So if you were to ask my mom what one of her favorite stories is, I was shedding crocodile tears. Well, it wouldn't be crocodile tears because remember, it didn't happen.
Right.
But let's just say I was shedding crocodile tears and claiming that people were putting blames on me. My mom talks about that thing till now, and I think that might have happened when I was 8 years old. You know what? Maybe I should just admit it. Yes, I broke it. Finally. I got that load off my shoulder. My dad's favorite story will be, I think I talked about this on Facebook, when I researched / plagiarized some of my sister's work and presented it to Miss Jarvis as my own. And Miss Jarvis called my dad and saying, look at this, look how Graham is when he applies himself, he does it. And Dad took one look at it and gave it back to Miss Jarvis and said, that's not Graham's handwriting.
Oh, God.
He will, if you were to ask him what, and listen, I would have been happy if he'd kept his mouth shut, if he'd bought a brand new wild cane on the way home and taken it out of me that night. I would have been fine. But no, he had to go and catch her. So I still have some issues with that he and I are going to need to work out. I know it's, almost 40 years later, but it still resonates. So I think those would be the two stories that my parents would tell about me. Neither of them being complimentary, of course.
What are you most proud of?
I am most proud of my little girl. Absolutely.
Finish this sentence. I look forward to Sunday evenings too.
I look forward to Sunday evenings to put my feet up, watch. Yeah, I look forward to Sunday evenings to watch football, to read, to multitask, which means watching football, reading, and being on Facebook at the same time.
If you could
I'm a very homebody guy.
If you could go back,
I'm a very homebody guy.
If you could go back in time, what would you tell the 14-year-old Graham?
I would tell the 14-year-old Graham to stop holding things in, because I realized that
The mic.
that's, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I realized that that's a, I don't want to call it a skill, but it's a trait I picked up very, very early. That I think probably because I didn't have a big brother to share stuff with. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of always I was always the big brother, which means that I couldn't go to anyone for help, or I couldn't show weakness.
Who do you talk to now when you want to? I mean, you don't have to mention their name, but do you have someone?
I do finally have people that I can open up to. But for a long time, I held everything in. I mean, I've had experience. I mean, I had problems, for example, when I was in college, that I mentioned it to my mom maybe 10 or 15 years after I graduated. And she was sitting in the car crying. And I'm like, Mom, it took place 15 years ago. Why are you upset? He says, and you never told anybody? You never told me? You never shared this with anybody? I have always been very... I don't think... it may just be defensive, or maybe I just didn't feel like anyone would care that much. And I was always... For me, it was always like working for Pepsi. I only gave the good news. I never gave the bad news.
In the chat room, CB said, I guess I missed the major part of the discussion. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts of the services provided by public schools? Karen G said, ha ha, Selwyn, you are funny. CB said, what are some suggestions for teachers? And then Abby said, he stepped on the kitchen garbage bin, climbed on it, broke it, and tried to say he didn't know. But I saw him and give them the update. Then Abby said, he thief and take Faith's research paper, the fool erased Faith's name and didn't even rewrite it, LOL. Deli said, Abby telling all the business. Abby said, LOL. Two things I have to
And those are
say.
my sisters, by the way, Abby and Nelly.
Oh, I know.
Well, not
I don't know
not
Delhi.
after this.
I didn't know Delhi, but I only wish that we had some time to address CB's questions. What are some suggestions for teachers? But if you can do that in 2 or 3 bullets, can you? You want to take it?
Teachers, patience,
Mhm.
and well, put it this way: many of the teachers that I have been fortunate to meet have been dedicated. However, I do know that in some public schools, especially those that are not well funded,
Mhm.
um, special education classrooms are glorified daycare. That's just an unfortunate fact.
That's your observation.
That's been my observation. That they're just glorified daycare. I would give more advice to parents than to teachers. Parents have to always, always, always be involved. You need to be in your kid's classroom once a week. You need. If I was to show you my cell phone, I have my daughter's her primary teacher, primary teacher's number, her aide's number, the speech therapist's number, the occupational therapist's number, the headmistress's number, on speed dial. You have to be on top of them. They have to know what you are sending your child there for, and that you're always going to be on top of them. You know.
Graham, the question I ask all my guests: what makes you laugh out loud?
I just laughed out loud, didn't I? There are, I don't know. There's some movies that I can watch 100 times and laugh in the same place. You must have seen Office Space.
Yes.
There are a couple of scenes in Office Space, and even though I know it's coming and I've seen it 100 times,
Yeah.
I laugh out loud every single time. I laugh out loud when my former sister Abby imitates somebody with a
Former sister.
former sister Abby imitates somebody with a Jamaican accent. She does it brilliantly, including where to drop the H's and where to add the H's.
The same Abby.
The same, yeah, Abby Locke. Well, like I said, former sister.
I did not know that.
Yes, she is hilarious. Absolutely hilarious at that. Things my daughter does. I mean, I talked about the fact that, like, if I bust my daughter, I don't want her going into the fridge, for example. She's a very healthy snacker.
Mm-hmm.
She will sit and eat a pint of strawberries or blueberries or whatever. She won't eat, junk food. But I don't want her eating and stuff all the time.
Uh-huh.
So if I happen to be in the living room and maybe I have something on top of the fridge, she's figured out that she needs to lift that chair and ease it over to the fridge and whatever, and she knows exactly when I can see her or not. So there are times that I hear a slight movement, and I sneak in and I stand up behind her like that, as she's, grabbing something she's not supposed to grab. And I clear my throat. She turns around and she'll blush. Like, okay, you got me. And I have to stand there and try not to laugh out loud. And it's absolutely, to me, it's extremely disarming. And on the rare occasion, if there was any chance that I was going to be pissed off seeing it, after she blushes and then gets down from the chair and then picks the chair up and puts it back where it's supposed to go and then kind of slowly walks off as if, I was going to do it anyway. That, I think, is what, if I laughed out loud, she would know. So I try not to. But that's got to be one of the more amusing things in my day-to-day, in my everyday.
I have to say this to my brother. This has been a pleasure. I mean, I wish the time was longer. Hour and a half seems so long when you invite people on the show, and then we get to talking, and it runs out like that.
I'm amazed that an hour and a half went by.
But I mean, I enjoyed this, Graham. I enjoyed for a number of reasons. You're like my brother. We went into Forest Forum at Queen's College. We went over to Bishop's. I mean, there was a question I wanted to ask you about that transition.
Right.
Let me just shoot it out. At QC, you were quiet, relatively, right? I know you got over to Bishop's. You just explode. I know your parents are watching, and you became this
extrovert.
Okay, let's leave it at that. Extrovert, right? What happened? Were you rebelling that we had to go over to Bishops? What was going on there?
I thought it was the only way I could get girls' attention.
All right. Okay. Cool.
And then I became,
I got it.
you know, what you see in front of me. Unfortunately, I was 41 at the time, so a lot of years went by in the middle.
Then he said Ayana also was responsible for all the great nicknames in our family. Dadu,
Yes.
Happy, and Berry? Berry?
Berry, yes.
Berry.
Yes.
Well, my brother, thank you.
Cello, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you very, very much for having me. I'm very impressed by everything you've done, and continued success to Conversations with Selvin. Thank you very much.
You know, you're welcome. I know you're an official member of CWS. You're coming back sometime soon.
Do I get a t-shirt or anything?
Terrence.
Yes.
Terrence has the t-shirt. And you know, he's a fellow Allen House person.
Yes.
We're not allowed to say Allen House on the show. Right, so.
Gotcha.
Good night, man.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.